Welcome to Thrive Deeper, an ongoing conversation with Dr. Matthew Jacoby, author of the Thrive Bible Reading Guides, teaching pastor, and leader of the Psalmist band Sons of Korah. Join us as we go deeper into the Bible, discussing the passages as we read them together with Thrive. Now here's your host, DJ Payne.
Hello and welcome to this. It's episode 20 of Thrive Deeper. It's your host, DJ Payne here. And thank you for tuning into a very special episode today. This one, Matt and I go very deep into the second chapter of the first book of Timothy. Why are we going deep in this? Well, this is one of the most controversial, talked about, asked about chapter in the modern era in the New Testament. Why? Well, it's got a lot of stuff to do about gender. It's got a lot of stuff to do about women's and men's roles in the church and how does it apply to this. We have received a flood of questions, and so that is why we're releasing this special episode, bonus episode, as we get ourselves back into schedule. Now, there's going to be a lot of questions coming out of this episode. I know that you'll have some. You might want to listen to this with a pen and a paper in hand so you can jot them down, or maybe on your phone or something like that, jot it in the notes. And you're going to want to contact us. I'm going to let you know how to do that at the end of this episode. So make sure you listen all the way through. And at the end of this episode, I'll be letting you know how to get in contact with us. All right. Now, prayerfully, pray right now that you would be able to listen and go through and let God open your mind as we look into this second chapter of the first book of Timothy. Join us next as Matthew and I delve into that here on Thrive Deeper.
No, there's a bit of a break, actually. A bit of a break. Good. Until, I think, Easter or something. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, it's a long break.
Now, usually when there's a long break like that, means that there's another album coming.
Yeah, we'll chip away at. I was going to say chop away at something, but chip away.
chop that tree down of a big album coming. Yeah. I'm very excited. I think you guys are in a really interesting time to see what comes next with the new projects and new albums.
Yeah, me too.
You say that like you have no idea what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, there's a bit of stuff in the works. Yeah, for me, I mean, I actually have to discipline myself to say, okay, I need to put aside time to do this because I've, got stuff for teaching, my lecturing role and then stuff for church. And it's just so easy for that to get crowded out.
Yeah.
And to me, not even touch an instrument.
Yeah.
I wear too many hats, I think.
All right. Oh, is this part of what we were talking about in the last episode of a dichotomy between the heart and the mind? You've made dichotomies for yourself across the board.
Maybe. All right. Let's move on.
We're looking at the book of First Timothy in the New Testament here, and last episode we covered the background of Timothy. We covered the background of where this letter came from, and even a bit of an overview of the book as a whole. But I think on this episode, and I think we need to do a bit of a deep dive in some of the issues, some of the red flags that people have been raising over this book. And there's so many different angles to talk about it.
Yeah. Namely the infamous few verses on gender roles in Timothy, which I would say are, the most, easily could say the most controversial and I think misunderstood verses in the New Testament.
Right, Well, it depends on your interpretation whether they're misunderstood. All right, well, this is going to be fun. Okay, let's get into it. In chapter 2, and this is a theme throughout both letters of these particular women in the church. But there's also, he talks about old men and other teachers and everything like that. But there's this theme here with women, Paul talking about the women in the church. So it starts in verse 8, where he says, "Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing." Because obviously there was a lot of anger and argument over the teaching that was going in there. And now we get into it. I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. And then he goes on in verse 11, a woman should learn in the quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first and then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. All right. Now, we should have said this beforehand. Trigger warning for all of our beloved feminist listeners right now. They're going to be very, very. What is going on? If you've never read this before and you're listening to this, all right, deep breaths.
Yeah, it's obviously it's very difficult actually to not read this through the lens of the abuse of this, and I've been struck by that as I have read this again. In our time and in our place, it's so politically incorrect. It says so many things that are politically incorrect. Now, I have this, in a way, like I get what the reaction is to, and I think that's valid. But I feel sometimes that the whole obsession with political correctness means that we just don't even allow ourselves to take on board what is being said here. That I feel we can almost be slaves to political correctness. So we just shut down and don't think anything beyond what we think we're allowed to think. So I'd ask us to just be a little open-minded with this. But I was also struck by how, because of associations, and I believe that there is an abuse here of male roles. The whole idea of male roles in relationships and in communities has been so abused over the last 2,000 years that it's almost. I wonder if it's ever going to be possible to really, to read this without that behind us. It's like to take, as an example, take an ordinary word that becomes a swear word, and I'm not going to give you an example.
Yeah.
But where originally it could have been a perfectly legitimate word, but just becomes at some point, becomes a swear word. And so you can't say that word without offending someone. And I feel like these verses have become like a swear word that as soon as we say them, it just has this impact, this shock element. And I mean, what we really need to do is get inside this, which we will in a moment.
Okay, so
there's that initial shock.
As we talk about the big culture picture here, Matt, because I think what you're talking about largely is the culture that we live in right now and that we're speaking into. But let me also say that I think the overwhelming majority of human beings alive right now would have no problem reading this culturally.
True.
I would say the overwhelming majority. It is the minority of Western culture around the world that has issues with these gender role models, whereas most other cultures from other different countries, and dare I even say it, other religions that would be reading this would go, of course, hello.
And one of the reasons that that's possible is actually because of the affluence of our culture.
Yes.
It's the unusual level of affluence in our culture that puts us in a slightly different position, doesn't necessitate the kind of things that would be needed in other cultures.
Yeah, but also the time. I'm like, if we jumped into a time machine and went back 50 years, just 50 years, most people in a Western culture would read this and go, yeah, of course, hello.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting really pinpointy here and saying that for us right now, it can be, whoa, what is going on here?
Yeah, but I think a lot of people would feel like, this is just taking us back to
patriarchal.
Yeah. But the thoughts straight away go to the abuses of that. And this is what I mean, is that there are so many abuses of this that it's difficult for us to view this in a positive way. So I think what we need to do is perhaps if we start broad, let's just start with a broad snapshot of the biblical view of gender.
But let me also just say, for the sake of argument, for history's sake, the abuses was the exception to the rule. That this model through the last 2,000 years of church history have been generally worked, and there hasn't been abuses in it. But as you're using the word abuse, which is a pretty heavy word there, and so I could see the abuse of this type of gender role. Yeah, it has happened over the years, but I don't think it's I don't think that's the norm. Are we splitting hairs here, or what?
Possibly.
Define what you mean.
I think in some ways it has been the norm in that, we're imperfect people and just the way that it has been popularly perceived. For example, even going back to the Victorian era, in which women are virtually seen as a commodity, as the possession of their husband. For all intents and purposes, I mean, it's interesting because Victoria, we talk about the Victorian era and she was the queen, and yet, to me, this gets it's interesting in a lot of the fiction that comes out. I mean, I know fiction is fiction, but, a lot of the fiction, that comes through, classic, George Eliot and Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and these classic, writers, as well as, French and Russian writers, and I've covered a fair bit of this material. And one of the interesting themes in all of this is the sort of plight of women and the popular view of womanhood and the status of wives compared to husband. Yeah. And in none of it do I see a reflection of the intent actually of what the Bible teaches of gender. I just see what I've called really an abuse of that. And not really what was intended, I think. So
do you see that coming out of the church, or do you see that something that's happening in culture and the church is over here?
It was like a lot of bad things in the last, if in a dominantly Christian culture you needed to justify something, where you justified it by the Bible.
Okay.
And so there are plenty of bad behaviors and bad things that have been justified with respect to the Bible, not because the Bible teaches it, but because people, wanted to live that way, and so they've found the justification that they wanted.
All right, we could travel down this pathway for a while, but we're getting again already. We're just getting stuck in the weeds. Let's get into it.
Yeah. So I suppose my point is that these abuses have called forth a very valid reaction and an emphasis on the equality of men and women, and I think that's a wonderful thing. My comment about political correctness is that it's just a feature of history that when there's been an abuse, and in fact the greater the abuse, the more this is the case, there is inevitably a giant pendulum swing in which we throw out we want to throw out some really dirty bathwater, and so we throw it out vigorously along with the baby that we're meant to be preserving.
Okay.
To use that,
I can agree with that.
So I think the first thing that we need to say some general comments about the biblical view of gender, in which we find in Genesis chapter 1 this picture that unambiguously shows that male and female were created in the image of God, but were both given authority and dominion together. So there's no sense of even the bit about the rib of woman being created from the rib of Adam. That's in no way, and actually the word there isn't rib, it's side. It could well be that Adam falls into a deep sleep in terms of vision, and it's like the two halves of that is literally split down the middle. That is being suggested, and I think that's a good possible interpretation of that. Anyway, but the point is that the biblical view is one of absolute equality. I mean, it seems silly to even say that, but the charges have been brought against the Bible to the contrary. So I need to underscore that. Yeah. Then you've got actually the case in the New Testament where where women are seen as every bit are accorded countercultural status of equality in the New Testament.
No,
church.
let me just jump in here. You've skipped over 5,000-6,000 years of human history there to jump into the New Testament. Can I just say that the Old Testament is full of women being on a culturally amazing, respected platform.
Yeah, that's right.
And there are so many women heroes in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's right.
Again and again and again, we see where God's heart is when it comes to them.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that they are held in, exactly as you say, they are held in this position of, the bearers of God's image and the deciders of God's promises in their own life.
That's right. And it's when you get to the New Testament that this really becomes really very clear. In the Gospels we see Jesus' countercultural respect for women, which wasn't the case really around him. I mean, Judaism should have preserved that idea that you're talking about. That is evident in Genesis chapter 1, but it really didn't. I mean, they slipped away with everyone else in their view of women. But Jesus is so countercultural in his respect for women. And then in the epistles, we're taught that, for example, that both husbands and wives belong to each other.
Yes.
Now, because, I mean, it's easy to miss how countercultural a lot of the teaching of Paul actually is in terms of, in these respects. But the fact that he teaches husbands and wives, you belong to each other, and in other words, it's not just that the wife belongs to the husband. He's wanting to make a point here. Yeah. And in fact, he's saying to the husbands, you have to love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So in other words, you need to give yourselves up for your wife. One of the classic abuses, and I think this is one of the things that comes out in, even a lot of the literature, even from the 19th century, is this idea that women are to completely give themselves up for their husband. Actually, it's that Paul teaches the very opposite. Yeah. So, and these teachings have no counterpart. The teachings of Paul, in terms of this idea that husbands and wives belong to each other and that they owe equal fidelity. This is the other thing. They owe equal fidelity to each other. That no one else thought that in the ancient world, either of those things. So these teachings have no counterpart in the ancient world. Now, recent historiography has confirmed the fact that Christian women enjoyed far greater equality than their pagan counterparts. And I've cited this evidence before, but this comes from evidence in the Christian catacombs in which women are buried with pretty much equal lengthy commemorations and inscriptions in the burials. And I know that's a small thing, but it says a lot. In other words, the lives of women were seen to be equally significant to men. And I know this is like a no-brainer to us, but at the time it was revolutionary in the Christian community. It was something, clearly the Christian community was doing something different to everyone else. One of the other interesting things in the early church, because of this idea that comes through Jesus and Paul, is that this respect for women, together with the Christian notion of the sanctity of life, prevented female infanticide, which was absolutely rife in the ancient world. So, I mean, girls were just not seen as valuable as boys in terms of birth.
And let's be brutally honest, that is not an uncommon thought today, right now. Yeah. It is something that the world is facing right now, exactly the same type of thing.
Yeah. In the Roman Empire, most girls were killed at birth. Yep. That's not an overstatement. Most girls were killed at birth. And this meant a shortage of women in society. And I mean, so the early church was completely different to this. In fact, this has been cited as one of the reasons for the incredible growth of Christianity as opposed to paganism, because they didn't kill, because so many women were killed in paganism that weren't in the early church. And again, this is because of this high value You see this in positions in the church. Women had positions of responsibility in the church. They were seated at the same table. They're recorded in the writings of Paul. He greets them all equally along with men. You don't get this when you read the letters of Cicero and Seneca and other, letters from this time. You wouldn't even think that women even existed. And yet in the writings of Paul, that they're recorded equal honor. All of that to say that, the idea that the New Testament has a lesser view of women in any respect is actually completely false.
Yes.
And that both the New Testament and the fruit of the New Testament in the early church bears out the fact that they actually took a completely different countercultural direction when it came to women. Now, society and human beings, our nature being what it is, drift backwards. And that actually is what happened, is that, the church drifted back through cultural pressure, into a view of women, I think, that was more denigrating. Not everywhere, and I think you made the point for it. Not everywhere.
Now, when you say the church, you're talking about the last 2,000 years of history.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Christendom.
Yeah, Christendom, really. Okay, so I think that's that's a fairly generally accepted fact. The idea that the New Testament is in some ways advocates a lower view of women. It's actually generally, I think, can be easily refuted.
Well, even if we go back even into just the last couple of hundred years, a lot of the pioneers of people who would be considered, birthing out this idea of women's rights in the Western culture, dare we say it, a lot of them had a church background or a Christian background that were coming at it scripturally and would quote scripture back to their male counterparts and saying, look, we are supposed to be equal here. A lot of it came out. Now, obviously, as a student of history, we both know a lot of it came out of anti-church type of thinking as well for those feminists. But from that very first, idea of women's rights, a lot of that came out of the church and Christian thinking as well.
Yeah, that's right. So
it's a fascinating study.
It is a fascinating study. So when we get, and of course, where this is addressed in the New Testament, where there are passages like this one in 1 Timothy 2 that I'm going to look at now, often the issue is that there is this newfound kind of freedom that women are enjoying in the Christian community, and it's almost to the point of overkill. And I think there is some sense of, hey, we just need we need to be a bit sensitive to our culture here as well. You know what I mean? Like, but there's almost like a sense of overkill to that, and I'll explain that in a moment. So coming to the text, I think it's firstly, it's important to get a sense of the context. So basically, the context for 1 Timothy is that false teachers of this Jewish Gnostic sort have infiltrated the church, and they're teaching a kind of exclusivist faith, of works and superior insight. They've infiltrated the church they've mainly infiltrated the church through the wealthy women in whose homes the church met, who, being generally uneducated, have fallen prey to these ideas. So Paul's going to ask them to respect church roles and observe boundaries in their freedom. So there's an issue of false teaching here. That's clearly, now we've recognized this in Timothy, this is the big issue. So I think it's important to read this section in Timothy against the background of that false teaching.
Well, and can again, to make it very clear, the idea that the church is facing false teaching is just as true now as it was back then.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, this is a thing that is not going away any time. We are at war with a lot of different aspects in our culture, with a spiritual war, with a teaching war, and that's what the that concept is constantly always there. So it's not when I'm saying that this is not a unique thing in this book of Timothy.
Yeah, there are unique aspects of this sort of false teaching, and we'll get to that in a moment. So Paul wants the Ephesian church, as he says here, to pray for the salvation of all people, right? Because there's kind of this exclusivist teaching of superior insight and aesthetic lives. And that really shut out people. And Paul's saying, I want you to pray for the salvation of all people. And, while they're praying, they have to do it in the right disposition, not coloured by anger or disputing, but characterised by holiness. And he wants, because it seems to have been a lot of disruption. He wants unity here, actually. And so, he doesn't want, disruption even through improper dress and emphasis on externals, and, he alludes to that in this practice. In speaking, about women and the disruption of the church, Paul adds that they're not to seek roles that would place them in positions of authority over men. Now we'll get into this in a moment. So, and then he enlarges on the type of person who types of people who does want in leadership.
Yeah, and that's chapter 3.
Yeah, that's chapter 3.
Yeah, where he says, listen, if you desire leadership in a church, it's a good thing. Yeah. Don't because again, he's gonna lay out some pretty heavy rules, and people will go, who wants to ever be in leadership of a church? And he says, no, it's a noble thing, but here's all the qualifications for you, and this is what you need.
That's right.
But that comes, as you said, that comes in chapter 3.
Yeah. So verse 8, he says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or quarrelling. So he's saying, guys, stop arguing, especially while you're praying, like they're, it's hard to imagine this, but they're arguing even while they're...
I can imagine. I've been in church congregations where a prayer time has turned into a theological battle.
Yeah, that's right.
Dear God, I thank you that I'm not like Matt Jacoby and I hold those false teachings,
That's right.
Exactly,
And then he says, likewise also that women should... I'm reading from the ESV. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and with gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So it would appear here that the women are dressing immodestly to the point that's causing disruption. Okay.
Yeah. And there's two levels of immodesty there. There's a modesty as far as, a physical modesty. Like when we hear of immodesty, we think of wearing something alluring, culturally inappropriate. But there's also a financial immodesty that Paul is addressing there.
Yeah, that's right.
Saying you've got this gold dangling off you here, women. That's not what you need to be. That's not attractive.
That's right. Yeah. So here is this Christian community. One of the things that was notable about the early Christian community was all the different classes of people sitting at the one communion table, right? Yeah. Like poor, rich, slave, free.
Everybody.
Now you've got women then parading their wealth. This is the problem.
Yes.
It's, as you say, I think he is meaning all sorts of modesty, but the one that he cites is modesty around wearing really expensive clothes.
Yeah.
Now, one scholar points out that clothing in the ancient world could cost as much as 7,000 denarii, which equaled more than 19 years' wages.
Wow.
For an average day worker. So this is the kind of difference, actually, the rich-poor difference in the ancient world. I mean, really rich, so that you could actually wear something that it would take someone that costs as much as 19 years worth of wages for a day worker. And that day worker's sitting there.
Yeah. And we think this is the bit that we don't sort of have in our heads in our culture. Other cultures still have this today, but that class system is pretty much gone for us as Australians, for Americans as well. There's still a bit of a class system in the UK, but not to the level of degree that we're talking about was happening in ancient Rome.
That's right, not to this level. And he's saying, come on, don't flaunt this. We're going for unity here. And this is causing disruption, right? This is this competitiveness and showing off. And so this is the modesty that he's calling for. He says here, let a woman learn quietly. Now, this is the thing that when we get to this, it's like, oh, great. Well, it's how patronising is that, you know? Well, I think actually this is where we need to recognise that actually the opportunity for women to learn itself is countercultural. In contrast to segments of Judaism that prohibited women from learning, he's saying this. Yeah. In fact, there's a classic quote from the Torah that says, sorry, not from the Torah, a classic quote from a rabbinic writing of that time, which says that better to burn the Torah than teach it to a woman at the time. Now, so he's actually, he's asserting the ability and value of women's education. So let them let the women learn.
And again, let's make it clear, like in the religious Jewish life, and again, there were similar practices in a different way on a different, the different end of the spectrum in, the Roman and Greek mystery religions around there, how they held, the gender views. But for the Jew, it was, the men were allowed to go into the worship area where the women weren't even allowed to be there for this type of teaching.
Yeah.
So there was definitely massive gaps and the church. This is where like you say, the church was so revolutionary. You're all at one table. We all want you to learn what you're all supposed to learn together.
Yeah.
But we have a particular issue right here for this one.
So, I mean, the background issue, again, we need to remember that the false teachers have taken hold of these matriarchs in the church. They're taking advantage of the fact that there is this newfound equality within the church, and women have these significant positions in the church, and so they're getting in through them, and so they're kind of railroading things. They've got these new views, and they're pushing these views, and Paul is just saying, listen, put a lid on it, like be respectful of the people that I've put in place in the church. So he's put elders in place to guard the teaching of the church, and he wants them to be submissive to those church leaders. So when he says, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness, he's not saying, it's not that all women should be submissive to all men. I mean, that's foreign to Paul's teaching. It's more likely here that he means that they're to be submissive to a certain group of men, in this case, to the leadership of the overseers in the church. It's like, because this is the problem in the church. Remember, it's a very specific situation. They're kind of taking over with this false teaching, and he's saying, listen, put a lid on it and submit to the rightful leaders in the church. So that's then he goes, verse 12. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach. Let me just talk about that for a moment. So there are some contextual things going on here. Clearly, because in other circumstances in the early church, we see women teaching. So
women leaders.
That's right.
Church.
Yeah. So there are clearly some contextual things going on here, namely this issue of false teachers. I think this is closely related to the subsequent discussion of overseers, and Paul, because he's talked about he talks in this letter about the importance of overseers being able to teach, and they've been prepared for this. So he's saying, let those who have been prepared, let them do the teaching. He goes on to say, Yeah, sorry, what were you?
I was going to say, I've heard somebody teach around this verse that this issue of having teaching or assuming authority, yes, it is about the eldership, but also has it got something to do with the husband and wife relationship? Is the man that they're talking about in here the husband of their, or is he getting into talking about actual husband and wives as well?
Yeah. So at this point, I feel like I want to prevent actually against explaining this away, and by that I mean there is something that Paul's looking to preserve here, something that is a biblical principle here, that he wants to preserve the structure of the family, what he sees as the appropriate structure of the family. It's got nothing to do with equality, but the idea that there is this primary responsibility. Now, we'll get to this in a moment, but that where there is this primary responsibility or role that guys have as leaders. And I think he wants to preserve that. Now, I know there's a lot of reaction to that. I'm just saying that comes through fairly clearly throughout the New Testament, that there is this expectation that guys take responsibility, a leadership responsibility. So he says here, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she's to remain quiet. Now, the term for authority here is probably pejorative. In other words, it's probably more like domineer or usurp. It has that. He's saying, I don't want you women to usurp the authority of appointed men who are leading this church. So the word rendered to have authority, authenteo, means to have mastery of, or more colloquially, as it's used elsewhere, to lord it over.
Yeah.
So in public meetings, he's saying that the Christian women should refrain from laying down the law and from lording it over the guys in this situation.
Yeah.
Because again, he's speaking at least in this case, he's speaking to a particular situation where this false teaching has come through in this way. Then he says, again, some people want to say, well, this is all just cultural. And yes, it is. There is some cultural elements going on here. But he does give theological, biblical reasons for that, and he goes back to Genesis. And this doesn't, for us, in our time, this doesn't make things better. And for a lot of people, I think this makes it worse, because verse 13, he says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. You think, oh, great. So great. He's saying that guys are better than,
No, not at all.
Actually, this actually, what he's pointing to here is actually the Jewish practice of primogeniture, which is basically this idea of the firstborn male having this leadership responsibility.
Okay.
It's the right of the firstborn.
Yeah.
Which actually was a feature very much in Jewish culture, but it was also a feature of. So it's like he's saying that the situation with males and females is very much like the situation among brothers and sisters who are all equal, but the firstborn has this special. Yeah. They're not any better. In fact, in a lot of cases, they were.
They were the worst. And also,
but there's this leadership. There's this kind of responsibility that's given to the firstborn.
There's a role they've been born into, and they didn't. Nothing that they generated themselves.
No.
Like Adam didn't choose to be made first. The firstborn isn't chosen to be born first. It's just the way that it is.
Yeah. So he's pointing to that as a Jewish person, he's illustrating this by pointing to this idea of primogeniture, I think, where he is saying, and I think it's a really good, I think it's a good reference here, because it underscores the fact that just like among brothers and sisters, the firstborn is not any better, or it's not about inequality. It's just about that happens. Someone has to have this role, and this is the role. And so he wants to say, well, there is a role of spiritual responsibility, and it's not like that really is what it is. It's a role of spiritual responsibility. It's like spiritual headship. It's not that the guy makes all the decisions and lays down the law and no, that is all done together. This is about a sense of like a spiritual gatekeeper.
Yeah.
This doesn't apply to, every, somehow that the guys have, because in the same way, we should recognize that leadership defined in the spiritual leadership, in fact, any sort of leadership in the New Testament is explicitly defined against the idea that it's some kind of lording it over. It's all in terms of service.
Yeah, and sacrifice.
Yeah, he who wants to be the greatest among you must become the least, must become like a slave.
Yeah.
And Jesus says that in terms of, who's going to be the greatest.
Yeah.
So this is the idea of spiritual leadership here. And this is where the distortion of cultural distortion comes in our minds, because we think, so the guy gets to be the leader and so he must be better and he gets to make all the decisions. No, that's not what leadership means actually. And it's, especially in terms of this role of spiritual gatekeeper, it's a real servant role here, one of self-sacrifice and so this is what Paul is operating with.
And it's almost like we give into, and he's going to go into it here, we give into that very first lie again, which is all about power. The lie of the serpent in the garden is about power.
Yeah.
And we give into that again.
Exactly.
And we go, we want this power. And it's like, no. This is just the way that it is. It's not about power.
Again, so we can easily read through this. So Adam was formed first, then Eve. So the idea here is leadership, just like in families with the firstborn. That's the point here. But then again, we think, leadership, that means that all the power goes to the guy. No, it's not. Because the authority, clearly from Genesis 1, the authority to rule over the earth was given to
both,
male and female together.
And he reiterates that here. The fact that we are all sinners, came from the choice of the woman. Yeah. She had just as much choice as the man, right. So he makes that clear, I think.
So, and then verse 14, he says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. So now what he is saying here is that he's pointing to the situation, I think, that is happening there. And he's saying what's happening here is just very similar to what happened in Genesis, that there was a reversal of these roles, and it's like Adam was prepared and equipped to perform this role of spiritual gatekeeper. So the serpent comes through the woman.
Yes,
it's not that she is any less able, or because the man falls victim straight away.
Yeah.
In fact, interestingly, in the other letters of Paul, he puts all of the responsibility on
Adam.
guys. Because it sounds, because he says, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Oh, great. Does that mean that it's all her fault?
Yeah, this whole thing of sin and death is because of Eve. No.
Actually, Paul does the very opposite in his other writings.
And
he points to guys and says, it's all your responsibility.
And that sort of, if you bring both of the teachings together, you go, okay, this idea of a couple working together as, the choice together that God sort of sees us as, you sort of get that picture from me bringing the both teachings together. It wasn't just Adam, it wasn't just Eve. They actually did it together, gang.
And this is where the way that what he's doing here is saying that there was a created order that includes that togetherness, that the serpent or Satan in the beginning disrupted that natural order and turned everything on its head. And it's as a result of that, and when you read Genesis 3, it's as a result of that, in fact, that God says to Eve, as a result of this, you've really mucked the natural order up, and as a result of this, men are going to lord it over women. That actually is stated not as a good thing, but as a bad thing that's going to ensue because of the corruption of human nature.
And then on the flip side of the coin, and women are going to desire, what the men have over here, type of thing. That's one of the curses.
So this, like all of that, again, and that's the lens through. Often we read this and think that this is actually affirming that. No, actually, it's the very opposite.
All right, now this last verse here in chapter 2, verse 15, about childbearing. Oh boy. This to me is probably the heaviest of them all.
Okay, so it says, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness and self-control. Now, remember, if we go back to the false teachings, remember one of the key features of the false teachings was this ascetic teaching where they were saying that marriage and sex and all of that is abstain from that.
Yep.
That you'll be lost if you do that. He's saying, no, you won't be. You can embrace sexuality in child, but your femininity in childbearing, and you will be saved through it. It's not like you don't have to, because remember, so much of the letter has been trying to prevent against this idea that you've got to deny all of these natural things in order to be saved. He's saying, no, you don't. You will be saved through childbearing.
So what he's not saying, tell me if I've got this right, or have I got it right? Is there a mystery in here where he's saying, because it's going right back to those. He's echoing what is happening in Genesis, very much so. So when he says women as in the womankind will be saved through childbearing, is he talking about literally bearing the child, or is he talking about women taking their place as that role in society? Where is he at here? Or is it both things?
It's. I think firstly the specific of letting them, he's saying you don't need to do all of these complicated things and deny who you are. You can get married, have children, and you'll be safe. It's like just focus on the things that God is calling you to do, and you will be saved through that. And it's not that he's not certainly not saying that. We're saved by doing certain things. And he's certainly not saying that there's something inherently salvific about childbirth, and by that I mean that there's, that childbirth somehow is some kind of punishment that saves women from, because that, again, that's sometimes misunderstood like that, that through all of that they all will be.
Some sort of penance or
some
something.
Kind of penance.
Yeah.
Certainly not saying that.
Okay, no.
I think he's got something very specific in mind here, and he's saying that through that travail and through them taking up their role, along with the other virtues that he mentions, that just be who God has called you to be.
Yes,
and through that you will be saved. That's really what he's saying there. And he's not saying that that you have to, that this is the role and that's your job. And he's certainly not saying that.
And for women out there who cannot bear a child or, who have chosen or been given the gift of singleness, you are somehow missing out.
Exactly. Said clearly in the context of the fact that there were false teachers that were telling them, no, you've got to deny all of that now.
Exactly.
And it was a feature of this, certainly of later Gnosticism, probably has its roots here, that there is no, that gender is, it's like this, we've got to deny gender and sexuality and all of that, as part of this sort of Gnosticism that's emerging here. And Paul's saying, no, we don't deny gender and sexuality and childbirth and,
the natural order of
all of
created
this stuff
things
in life. You don't need to deny all of that to be saved. So, just I think to finish here, the Message version is an interesting paraphrase of this. And I think I acknowledge it's a really tricky section of Scripture. It's very tricky because it's very countercultural. It's very difficult not to read this through the lens of all of the abuses and more than just about any other Scripture. So, and there are also inherent difficulties actually in interpreting this passage anyway. So, but I think Eugene Peterson does a good job in the Message here of paraphrasing this.
Do you want me to read out the Message part of it?
Sure.
So starting in verse 8 again, when he talks about prayer, Eugene, and again, just shout out to Eugene Peterson at the moment. News came out this week that he's on his deathbed. And as someone who's been an amazing writer, an amazing pastor, and a teacher of teachers in our generation, he's had, I think he's sitting around about 85, 86 years old, years of age. God bless you, Eugene. We thank you so much for, everything you've done. Yeah. He says, since prayer is at the bottom of this, what I want mostly is for men to pray, not shaking angry fists at enemies, but raising holy hands to God. And I want women to get in there with the men in humility before God, not primping before a mirror or chasing the latest fashions, but doing something beautiful for God and become beautiful by doing it. I don't let women take over and tell men what to do. They should study to be quiet and obedient along with everybody else. Adam was made first and then Eve. Women was the seed first, our pioneer in sin, with Adam right on her heels. On the other hand, her childbearing brought about salvation, reversing Eve. But this salvation only comes to those who continue in faith and love and holiness, gathering into maturity. You can depend on this.
I think he picks up the spirit of
that's great.
Of the text, and I think that's a really important thing when reading the scripture is getting the big picture and the spirit of what the text is trying to say.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right, well, if you've got questions about any of that, do we want to hear questions about this, Matt? Am I putting you on the spot?
Well, look, I'm not sure if there's that much more I can say. I think whole books have been written about this, and it has sparked a lot of discussion. And
well, okay, I'm going to end with this. Okay, I'm going to speak to the person now, especially the young lady who's hearing us talk, and still feels that inside. Speak to her right now, and she's going, but Matt, how do you? What advice do you give?
I have to think about that. I get that it's a difficult passage to read in our day and age, but the spirit of the New Testament is one in which we get to be who God has made us to be. We're not made to be all the same. The New Testament is just filled with exhortations. Don't look at different people are created in different ways and in different shapes and forms, and we can validate those differences. And, there are different roles, and I think, it is a facet of human nature that we're constantly reaching out of what we are when, and I think this is where there are so many abuses of these very, very principles. So I think the spirit of Paul here is something that is liberating. It's not meant to be restrictive in any sense. It's designed to bring about order in a Christian community, mutual respect, respect for authorities, servant leadership, all of the virtues of respect and love and humility, mutual submission. These aren't things that are just for one they're for us all. They're all principles that we all need to exercise. And so I think focus on those big ideas and don't get too perturbed by something that is, written to a particular situation, is very complex. Try and grab the big idea of this. And the big idea is that we are called to live a life of submission to Christ, submission to one another, mutual respect for each other, and overall as a community to live in unity with one another.
Oh boy, did you make it all the way through? How many times did you have to stop and write something down, or stop and pray for some understanding there? I'm sure you have many questions and comments about this. Well, we would love to hear all of them. Please head over to thrivetoday.net.au. That's our home on the web, thrivetoday.net.au. You'll see up the top right-hand corner, it'll say contact. and you'll see two contact forms. Whether you're on a desktop browser or you're on your phone, you might have to scroll down, or you might have to look on the right-hand side, and it'll say submit a question for the podcast Thrive Deeper. That's the form that you're looking for. If you fill that in and send that to us, we will get that directly, and we will answer your questions on an upcoming episode. All right, until next week, this has been DJ Payne thanking you for listening to Thrive Deeper.
Thank you so much for listening to Thrive Deeper. We value all our listening community. If you are on Facebook, search and like Thrive Today page to get all of our latest updates. Our home on the internet is at thrivetoday.net.au. There you can subscribe to the Thrive Daily Reading Guide and contact us directly. That's at thrivetoday.net.au. Until next time, thrive.